Welcome to the Fulcrum Roundtable. The program offers insights and discussions about some of the most talked about topics from the previous month, featuring Fulcrum's collaborators. Consistent with the Fulcrum's mission, the Fulcrum Roundtable strives to share many perspectives to widen our audience's viewpoints. I'm Hugo Balta, Executive Editor of the Fulcrum and your host. Today's discussion centers on the rising threat of political violence in the United States following the assassination of Charlie Kirk. We'll examine how inflammatory rhetoric, online radicalization, and hyper-partisan media ecosystems have fueled a climate where violence is no longer a fringe concern, it's an increasingly present danger. This moment demands honest reflection on how our public discourse, digital platforms, and political leadership either confront or enable this volatility. Joining us are Kurt Gray, Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and author of Outrage, Why We Fight About Morality and Politics. Laura Fulcrum, President of the Independent Center and a consumer psychologist. Mac Chamberlain, a fourth-year English and Spanish major at Lipscomb University. Kurt, let's start the conversation with you. You and Laura penned Taking Outrage Seriously, Understanding the Moral Signals Behind Political Anger. You write in part, when conservatives express outrage, liberals dismiss them as bigots and racists. When liberals protest, conservatives roll their eyes at the alleged virtual signaling. We celebrate when our adversaries get upset because their anger means our side is winning. Tell us more about that.
Great. So morality is maybe one of the most important concepts in our lives, in our society, right? We're deeply compelled to judge those who do wrong things as evil. And the reason that we care so much about morality is because morality evolved to protect us and our families and our societies. And so when we get morally outraged, it's because we feel threatened, right? We see someone doing something evil, something bad, and we react to that harm that we see. And so when someone mocks us for getting outraged, right, that's really a dismissal of the feelings of threat. We don't feel heard, we don't feel seen, and we feel even more threatened. And so this idea of, mocking the other side for getting angry assumes that the other side gets angry because they're trying to win fake internet points or they don't really feel it. But we do really feel it when we get outraged. And the reason the other side doesn't get it is because they don't feel the same threats that we do. And so appreciating that is essential for moving forward.
Now, Laura, dismissing the other side's outrage is potentially dangerous, a dangerous mistake. So what do we do? Kurt just explained why there's this leaning about almost celebrating the angst that the other side gets from what we're writing or what we're saying or our positions. Now, you say first take outrage seriously. Tell us about that and the other two steps that you mentioned we should consider taking.
Yeah, so the problem with dismissing the other side's outrage is that it just creates this cycle, right? Where in order to feel heard, people voice their complaints in even stronger form, right? They say it more loudly, they say it with more anger, they convey themselves in a more extreme form. And we can see this escalation happening right now in the news cycle. So the thing that we suggest to people is that they need to take that outrage seriously and actually hear what that other side is saying. Like Kurt was saying, being outraged means that you feel something really deeply. And I think we would all do better to hear the message behind that emotion and try to understand what exactly people across the political aisle are trying to convey to us. And then the other recommendations we had were to not respond to outrage with more outrage. I think it's become kind of tempting to respond with almost glee at seeing one side of the political spectrum as being upset, or to see it as just more evidence of how wrong they are. But if we can use it as a pointer to go and listen and have a conversation where you try to actually understand what's upsetting to this person, and maybe this is even a shared area of concern. We talk in the op-ed a little bit about examples of concerns that are shared on the left and right that are expressed in different ways, but the same baseline concern is motivating both.
What's the role that social media and news media, and particularly legacy media, mainstream media, plays in fanning the flames of less discourse, as you've mentioned, Laura? We need to talk to each other more and listen more to each other, and really just about who yells the loudest in the room, and figuratively speaking. Laura?
Yeah, so we know that actually emotions that are high in arousal, so they have a lot of energy with them, are things like outrage and anger. And they actually prompt people to do things like reshare posts, give money, comment, right? It drives a lot of behavior. So, like, we can see really clearly why social media operates this way and how it monetizes outrage. But if you step outside of that ecosystem and talk to regular people, what you see really quickly is that the world as it's portrayed in social media is really different from the world in your neighborhood, and there are lots of examples when you're interacting with people face to face where you can see that there's a disconnect between these two worlds, right? So these are people being thoughtful and kind in the line at the post office. They are having litter pickups in their community. And I think when we have these shared projects that aren't about politics, they're about the places we live and are invested, that's the best way to sort of step outside of that outrage cycle and see that, it's not reality.
Shouldn't we be holding news media to a higher standard, not just on social media, but in the legacy channels, television, radio, newspapers, even digital, to really be fair and accurate and not lean to the left or lean to the right? Because that's, those are the inflection points that they know are going to move the needle in ratings. Kurt?
Yeah. I mean, there's an old phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, right? That captures even traditional media. So on the nightly news, in your neighborhood, there's people coming to get you, there's crime, right? I mean, newspapers, this threat, these serial killers, they're out there, right? This national threat, this other country. I mean, as long as you can probably think back to having news, I don't know, the Middle Ages, Penny Dreadfuls, something like that, it's always been about threat because that's what drives our mind, right? Our minds are kind of hardwired to be concerned about threats because if your ancestors weren't, they got eaten, right? They got killed. And so news media can't really help but emphasize threats because that's what we want to read about, right? That's what we want to guard ourselves against. At the same time, right, there's a difference between saying like there's a threat out there and you can do this to kind of help yourself prepare for it versus unleashing a moral panic, right? Reefer madness, Dungeons and Dragons, satanic rituals, all these moral panics, things that we've studied, right, really kind of drive outrage and really drive kind of like paranoia. And so I think what the news media needs to do is really start with science, start with checking the fact, right? Are these things really destroying America? Are they really tearing apart communities? Or are we just trying to get ratings? So I think it's okay to get ratings, but you need to think about what's true. And once you do that, I think you can, dial down the temperature and have those conversations that Laura was talking about.
Mac, I'd like to continue the conversation with you. In an empathetic approach to political violence, you wrote, the ability to condemn political violence correlates with privilege, a perspective which implicitly trusts the power of our voices. We must consider what shapes the imagination of communities whose voices have been ferociously limited. For communities whose networks are saturated in such language of violence, we must accept a posture of humility in understanding how they feel they can gain access. Now, I think it's a very interesting take. You're arguing that sometimes that's the only course of action communities have. Please explain.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's like you were talking about just with Kurt and Laura, just then like, um, the reality is that public media becomes, sort of internal dialogue. It's a dialogue that we all participate in, and it inevitably sort of informs your self-perception. And so when you create this dialogue that like trans people are terrorists or that gay people are pedophiles or these things like that, like people inevitably sort of internalize those things, which really begins to affect and restrict how you can think about yourself and how you can see yourself engaging with these systems that are supposed to hold space for you. And so I think maybe more of what my article is getting at isn't so much um, to say that violence is inherently the only option, but more to for people who are quick to condemn violence, because we are, because like Kurt said or earlier, morals are vital to who we are. It's essential to how we operate, and outrage is important to how we operate too. But you know, when we, from a certain perspective, like we have this opportunity to be here and to talk, and we have this time and opportunity to write and engage with these ideas. People who have been, so systemically disenfranchised don't necessarily have those opportunities. And so I think more of what I write towards isn't necessarily setting down what you believe, setting down your sense of morality to suggest that violence is acceptable, but more like the quote says, accepting a posture of humility to say, I cannot even imagine feeling like my options have been so limited, to where, violence is the only thing. So it's not, I think logically we all sort of understand how revolt works. An oppressive system seeks to disenfranchise, to disempower certain people, and so those people act. But I feel like, in an advancing world with increasing comfort for more people, I think we've gotten very sanitary about those things. And so we think that like a morality that we are afforded to believe in because we have access, cannot necessarily apply to everyone. And so yeah, I think it's more about setting down our personal outrage at what we know to be wrong, um, because you know what other options do some of these people have, or what other options are they able to imagine themselves having?
Yeah. And I want to again double down. No one, beginning with you, Mac, is condoning violence. Of course not. But I do think, and I do agree with you that sometimes for for certain communities, disenfranchised communities, the only way to get attention is through the destruction of property. And we've seen that time and time again. Laura, Kirk, we've talked a lot about the importance of bringing it back to the table, right? To having discussions and debate in a responsible way. But what about those communities that feel like that's not for us? That's never a viable option for us, no matter how often we try that path. What are your thoughts in regards to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in because I guess I think there is a truth there of some folks and some communities are more marginalized. You can look at statistics, you can look at governmental policy, you can look at history, you can look at economic disparities and wealth inequality. At the same time, disadvantage and feeling threat are in the mind of the beholder, right? And so I talk to folks who you would not assume are part of disadvantaged groups, right? So let's say white kind of Christian nationalists, right? So these are folks who, as white men, they have more kind of leeway when it comes to their behavior and their actions through history, right? They were never part of a legacy that was enslaved. And yet these are the folks, right, that feel especially threatened. These are the folks that sometimes that feel that violence acceptable. So we say, well, violence is acceptable when people are threatened. Well, people say, well, I feel threatened. And certainly, right, like I can't be a Christian nationalist. My constitutional rights are under attack. And so I should engage in violence, right? I should start a militia in Montana or Idaho. And so I think, it's a hard place to draw the line with what some folks say are oppressed and other folks say, well, I'm oppressed, right? It gets into challenges whenever we license violence at all.
Yeah. Laura?
Yeah, so I think maybe we can sort of thread the needle by saying we never want to condone violence, but we need to sort of hear the escalating rhetoric that's happening politically for what it is, because that's how we get on the off ramp from where we're headed right now. And I think what's happened in a lot of cases is people feel like neither political party is representing them, right? And so they really don't have a channel to make their views heard, or they're sort of like observing this escalating rhetoric between right and left that seems like it doesn't represent their views, right? So I agree that there's sort of this larger problem of disenfranchisement that we're not taking into account. And I think one of the best things that we can do is participate in the political process. And I think it's unfortunately far less satisfying than flaming people in the comments section of your newspaper or on social media. There's this instantaneous sort of feeling of vindication that comes from that we don't get from participating in the democratic process. But as more and more people are looking at their political parties and saying, this isn't for me, this is not me that you're representing. My hope is that's how we get more of this viewpoint diversity represented in all of our at every level of political life and civic life.
Mac, you're also talking about generational differences. Do you feel that you have, independent of the Fulcrum, of course, an outlet to voice your discontent or your support in the same way that other groups, including different generations, have?
Yeah, it's interesting because, our instinct now is that we go to social media for those things. That's sort of become our political forum and where we voice discontent. And so it's interesting. I think that sort of puts a bomb on our frustration, but I wonder about its long-term efficacy. We put a lot of pressure on people like artists and celebrities to be vocal. And I think that partially stems from a feeling of powerlessness from just young people in general we recognize our influence on these people who thank us for supporting them because we make their livelihoods possible. But we do not feel that respect coming towards us from our representatives necessarily. And so we expect that people whose maybe it's not their job title is to be an advocate, like some people are just singers. And I think we have to learn to be okay with that and expect more respect from our representatives. But we just feel so little of that. And of course, there are representatives who are very active on social media, people like AOC. But unfortunately, a lot of the people who are very active on social media are also people like Nancy Mace, whose rhetoric intentionally, targets a lot of people of different identities, and especially people who are still in the process of becoming who they are as young people. And so I think there's a lot of disenfranchisement with that. And so that's why I think we see so much social pressure on social media is, that's one of the things that we can grab at to try and make people feel responsible.
Yeah. Sometimes that's the only outlet. Before I let you all go, any last nugget of advice to close those gaps in regards to the increasing polarization that we're all experiencing?
Yeah, I think Mac's point was a really important one about young people feeling like they don't have direct agency in their lives and that they have to go through artists and famous people in order to enact the things they think are important. And, to some extent, I think that's relatable for people of all ages, because as long as your focus is on the national stage and what famous people are doing, right, what Congress is doing or the president, it sort of takes the power away from you as an individual. So if you want to experience agency in your life, I think the best thing that's available to you is in your own community, right? And maybe that won't be around politics, but it will be around what's important to you and your neighbors and your community. And I think that can be a way to not only feel like you have some agency, but to work on projects with people across the political spectrum, because it's much harder to dismiss somebody for differing views on whatever subject it is when you're actually trying to accomplish something. And people will talk about this really frequently, like there's higher levels of trust for local levels of government, and it's because those people actually know each other and they work together to make life better where they live. So maybe, the first step is for all of us to kind of have a step back and look at what we could be doing in our own backyards rather than just focusing on the things that are so concerning, so outraging on the national stage.
That's an excellent point. Too often, and I see it a lot in news media, people are regulated to their titles and their political affiliations. And I think what we need to do, and it's something that in complicating the narratives, we look to do is humanize people.
Mhm.
We're more than just our titles. We're your neighbors, your teachers, the person you see in the grocery store. And you're right, at the local level, that's where what's closest to us, we can start to have real conversations, difficult, but real conversations. Kurt?
Just to echo what Laura said, right? When you're focused on the local, then you can talk about something concrete, right? So if you're meeting a neighbor, you can talk about the bad traffic. You could talk about, the cat that's eating squirrels in your neighborhood, right? And there's one across the street. And those are things that like it doesn't matter if you like D or R, right? You can still resonate. But if you're on social media, all you can talk about, and we have some work on this, right? The conversation immediately gets, I don't know, elevated or in some ways debased into just talking about morality and power, because those are things that everyone understands no matter their community, right? So maybe someone in California right now, doesn't care about the squirrel eating cat across the street, but they do really care about presidential politics. And so I think you can build apps, and there are places out there that are building kind of social media to have more local conversations, to make it less asynchronous, less yelling at each other. And maybe that's the future for, the younger folks, as Mac was talking about, people who are really trying to innovate on these platforms and not just like scrolling forever to give money to billionaires, right? And to actually have conversations and engage in authentic change. So I don't think we need to throw aside social media, but I think we need to focus on platforms that enable real connection and real conversation.
I have friends that are liberal and conservative, and I'm sort of somewhere in the middle. But I tell my friends, I'm like, we're not friends because of our political ideologies. We're friends for so many other things. We we usually agree on the things that we want to accomplish personally for our families, for our community. We just defer on the path on reaching those goals. And so I think if we begin with the things that we have in common, then there's space to not try to convince you to come to my side, because then that creates an us versus them, a you're wrong and I'm right, but really just to acknowledge we agree on the out on the what the finish line looks like. Let's at least acknowledge there might be different paths to reaching, to crossing that finish line. Mac, you have the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to do because of how, intensely polarized things are. And I think what is sort of at the core of what I wrote about and spoke about, and I think what is essential also to what Kurt and Laura spoke about, is a lot of our issues are deeply rooted in language, which is just so already a normal part of how we think. And so our response to these like hot button terms and these, there's a lot of hateful and a terrible verbiage coming from the top towards, it feels like kicking down a little bit. And so, it makes us express our outrage towards everyone else who's also maybe on the bottom with us, because that's where we feel we can express it. So I think that means, for people who do have opportunities to speak like we do and to write like we do, that means that language is essential to how we operate. And I think like that's part of why young people expect influencers and celebrities to be responsible, is because they're creating linguistic output that everyone internalizes, that everyone who listens to them internalizes. And so I think, if we want to start seriously thinking about healing this open wound that is the political gap in America, we have to suture our language first. It has to sort of be the connective tissue, because that's how we have access to each other. And so, yeah, I think when our language hinges on violence, that's why violence erupts. And if we think about more carefully representing what we think, we can hopefully work towards a future where we minimize that.
This is the Fulcrum Roundtable, insights and discussion about some of the most talked about topics of the previous month with Fulcrum collaborators. I'm Hugo Balta. Hasta la próxima.